I am Terrell Jermaine Starr, senior reporter with The Root, and I am here with presidential candidate and the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. What's going on?
Feeling good. It's good to be here.
We're above Times Square, right? Which is the epicenter of everything that people associate with New York City.
Yeah.
And you are the mayor.
Yes, sir.
Of the biggest city in America. So how does running this city prepare you to be president of the United States?
So this place is the most diverse place on earth. Probably, I'd say, one of the most intense places, certainly in this country, and the demands put on the mayor are endless, 24/7. The job has been called for a long time the second toughest job in America. And I think one of the things that's important to recognize in this election is there's a lot of very good candidates. I'm a Democrat. I'm proud of this group of candidates. But going from a candidate to president of the United States is a huge, huge jump. Being able to get things done for millions and millions of people is very different than just talking about good ideas. And the reason I'm running for president is because I've been running this place, 8.6 million people, all the challenges, and getting a lot of stuff done for people, making changes, taking on a lot of the powers that be. And I think that's an ideal preparation for the presidency. Because the presidency, that's the ultimate in terms of nonstop challenges, crises, trying to deal with a whole world out there. And if you have not been exposed to actual leadership, actual executive leadership, I think it's going to be very, very tough for a lot of folks. But I have some of the, I think, the best grounding you could possibly ask for, having move this place in a lot of the ways it needed to be, especially a place, when I was running for mayor, I talked about a tale of two cities here. Tremendous inequality on many levels. We still have a long way to go. But I can show people really tangible things we did to get kids better education, change relationship between police and community, get people economic opportunity, raise the floor for working people. So that's the kind of thing you need in a president.
Yes, let's talk about some of those things, right? Let's talk about the minimum wage.
Yes.
And so for city workers, you increased that wage up to $15, and you supported a citywide effort in the same vein. So what do you think it'll take for the rest of the country to catch up with $15 an hour?
Political will. I mean, this is, when I advocated for the $15 minimum wage, not only Republicans, but a lot of Democrats were saying, this is going to go too far, this is going to lose us jobs, this is going to hurt the economy. There were plenty of Democrats, too, who were gun-shy on this issue. And I believed that you just had to ask the question, what's minimum wage supposed to mean? It's supposed to mean some basic standard of living for people. And if you're not at $15 an hour, you're going to have a tough time surviving here and all over the country. So it was about political will. It was about continually pushing the spectrum to get there. First we did in New York City. That helped push New York State to act. There's a will all over this country. By the way, blue states and red states. Red states were some of the places that passed referenda to raise the minimum wage. So there's a growing recognition that the minimum wage in this country is absolutely unacceptable. I think this should be one of the focal point issues in this campaign, that we're going to actually make sure that everyone in America has a $15 minimum wage in the next few years, change people's lives, and then recognize the idea is minimum. This is not where we want to end for working people. We want to do a lot better than that.
But how would you, because the thing is that you ran into a lot of challenges even in New York City, which is perceived to be liberal. So across the country, functionally, how do you, as a president, would you be able to convince Congress that this needs to be $15 an hour?
I think the way you make change in general is to use the bully pulpit, to show people what's possible, to show them it can be done, to demystify. Think about so many of the big changes that have happened in our society. It took leadership saying, we can go here, we can make it work. So right now, we haven't had that on a presidential level with $15 an hour. And I think one of the things we learned from looking at presidents in the past was they were proselytizers, they were educators, they were mobilizers, they were organizers. They went out into the states, including the states where there was those recalcitrant senators, and they pushed for the change. Now, you made a point, this place is perceived to be liberal.
Right.
But I want to tell you, there's often more than meets the eye. I'm the first Democrat reelected mayor in New York City since the 1980s. We had 20 years of Republican mayors before me, Rudy Giuliani and Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg was the richest man in New York City when he got elected mayor. and someone who was not friendly to ideas like a $15 minimum wage. And so there was a huge amount of institutional power and a very strong business community that were arrayed against this. And that's why I said it was not just Republicans. A lot of Democrats were swayed by that or were fearful of making the change. It took, even here, a lot of us pushing the spectrum and saying, no, this has to happen because people just cannot live on the minimum wage we have. Right. And we changed hearts and minds and we created political pressure. Look, how does most change happen? You build political pressure on the folks who stand in the way. But if you have a president building that pressure, organizing out there with people, that makes a world of difference.
I have a final question for you in that regard. So there are a lot of people who feel like, especially in New York City, $15 is not enough. Yeah. And so would you advocate for the minimum wage being higher than $15?
First, get to 15 across this country. That's job one. But yeah, it's supposed to move with the times. So I very much believe you have it constantly, by law, it should be tagged to inflation. Inflation goes up, the minimum wage should go up. Mm-hmm. And not have to have this fight every time, but have it be just something that's built in. But minimum is the crucial point here. This is not what we aspire to for working people. This is the floor we want to set. And I believe in a lot of other big changes that we've done here as well. Things like paid family leave, paid sick leave, that really change people's lives. We've got to change the concept of what American working people can expect. Because right now, most people don't expect much at all. The minimum wage is too low. There's almost none of those other family benefits guaranteed in much of the country. And we've got to change that assumption. And people are working so hard in this country, and they have for a long time. But for a lot of working class people and middle class people, they're pretty stuck economically in terms of their family life, what they can depend on. We've got to change that whole assumption. But then there's a second question, which is where do we want to take people? I don't want to take people just to minimum wage. I want to secure the minimum wage and those core benefits and then build an economy that actually gives people a lot more than that. Because this massive skew we have now, where there's a 1% with the vast majority of the wealth and power and then everybody else, that's not a sustainable model for this country.
Right, and so let's move on to marijuana decriminalization in New York City, which has recently happened. If we want...
Partially happened.
Correct, thank you. It's partially happened, right? And so can you explain to us how we can even get to a partial decriminalization across the country?
Yeah, I think this is another example where I think that the consciousness has changed intensely. And it's a leadership question also. We need a president of the United States that says, come on, it's time to make this change. First of all, let's expunge the records of all those folks who suffered for low-level offenses, carry that record with them, and it's encumbering them to this day. That should be part of the change. Decriminalize so that folks are not in danger of that situation again. But I have a bigger vision of legalization. I put this out the end of last year. That we have a chance to do what some states have done on a national level, legalize with a framework that actually empowers communities that so often has taken it on the chin with the laws we have, the drug laws we have. Communities of color that paid the price for the wrong kind of laws could now disproportionately benefit under a legalization scheme that's not about corporate America, not about, let them do whatever they want to do in the business world, but actually a set of ground rules. And I say to folks, look, we sometimes labor under the assumption we have to do things the way they're done in the past. And that brought us some really bad outcomes. Tobacco industry ran wild, tried to hook young people on tobacco. Pharmaceutical industry, what they did with opioids, and there was an assumption of there was only so much regulation, let them do what they're going to do. Here's a chance to build a whole new industry from scratch with a set of ground rules that's anti-corporate. Not about corporate America, about community-based businesses.
Can you just describe one of the main things, the aspect of that?
Yeah. What you do is you limit the kinds of structures of the businesses so that it pushes away from the big corporate model. You build a model that favors local small businesses, and then there's got to be a government role in that too.
So they're not priced out of participating in the industry.
Correct. And this is where I think the government role is important to acknowledge. Providing the economic incentives and supports that community-based businesses can thrive. Look, we know there's going to be a huge market, right? We know a lot of money is going to change hands. Why don't we say, okay, we have a strategic opportunity to put money in the hands of a lot of people who got the short end of the stick before?
Namely black and brown people.
Correct. Black and brown people in America suffered very disproportionately from those draconian laws that sent people away for a long time for very small offenses, nonviolent offenses. Families still paying for that right now, millions of people affected. Here's a chance to do something that's actually tangible to make it right for folks, but not just once. But imagine if you build a whole new industry, a lucrative industry, focused on communities that have not gotten their fair share of economic development. The ground rules, and we forget this because we've been told for so long there's only one way to do things. You know, you just have these loose rules, which the Republicans have favored, allow corporate America to do what they want. Once upon a time, not so long ago, there were really clear structures that limited the choices of corporate America. I'm going even farther here. And I put this out again in a report in December. Literally box corporate America out of the equation, make it all about community-based smaller businesses with the kinds of economic support from the government so they can become viable. Once that market is opened up, these businesses will flourish. They'll employ people from the community, so it becomes a virtuous circle. We have the power to do that.
So let's move on to policing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about people who are disproportionately impacted. This is something that you've always talked about, even when you were running for mayor the first time and throughout your time as mayor. But also, you supported cracking down on fare evasion in New York City at particular subway stations where it's been most impactful, right? Consequently, people of color are disproportionately arrested as a result of that. And some of your critics have said that the approach to deploying more police at these stations does nothing more than criminalize black and brown people. What do you say to those critics who say that?
Well, we've stopped arresting people is the first thing I say. There is a misunderstanding out there, and I want to correct it, that even we take some of these offenses very seriously. I mean, if you're someone who goes on the subway and you pay your fare, which is the vast, vast majority of people, you don't want to see other people just breezing on by not paying their fare. So there has to be some kind of rule, some kind of enforcement.
Let me interject briefly in that.
Yeah.
Now, some people would say that one of the major issues behind people jumping the fare is not because they don't want to be unfair, it's because the fares are just simply too high and that they cannot afford it and that people do it out of desperation.
No, I appreciate, look, I've spent my life trying to work on issues of economic justice, so I understand that there's a lot of people in this city who are hurting and all over the country, which is why we've done things like raise the minimum wage and provide people with better benefits and open up a whole host of opportunities, because I want to go at the root cause. In other words, you're right, there are some people jumping the fare out of desperation. There are some people jumping for other reasons, but evading the fare, I should say. But let's be clear, we're not going to solve that problem by being lax about enforcement. We have to go to the core of that by giving people a better economic reality in a very, very systematic manner. But here's the crucial point. We stopped arresting for low-level marijuana offenses. We stopped arresting for a whole host of quality of life crimes. We gave a summons instead. In New York City in 2018, there are 150,000 fewer arrests than 5 years earlier, and we got safer.
The difference, I'm asking you specifically about jumping the turnstiles, right? And so between 2014 and 2018, according to an analysis by the Marshall Project, 89% of those people who have been arrested were black or Hispanic. And so I think the question is there a non-police way to address this issue?
For the offense itself, we don't arrest anymore. That's crucial to understand. That was a policy change. If there's an outstanding warrant or an act of violence committed at the same time, that's a different discussion. But just say, typical case, often a young person jumps turnstile, we don't arrest for that anymore. So that's the number one answer to your question. But to the question of whether it may be economically based for some people, it is, I'm sure. One, we created a new initiative, Fair Fares, to provide half-price Metro cards for lower-income folks on a vast scale in this city. So we're going at that core economic reality, and that's starting to be picked up more and more, people using that. But beyond that, again, let's go to root cause. We need to create a society that actually provides economic opportunity on a mass scale for black and brown people, particularly young people. That has not been true for generations. We have a chance to do that now. And we have some actual evidence here in this city of what happens when you create that dynamic, when you raise wages, raise benefits. Hundreds of thousands of people have come out of poverty in my 6 years as mayor because we had that approach. Imagine if we amplified that with the kind of discussion, the kind of approach I'm talking about, for example, with legalization of marijuana and community-based businesses. You keep doing this, you get at the root cause.
I think the main question, and we can just move on to something else, is that these numbers from 2014 to 2018 have gone, into your second term, and people are still looking at this and saying, under your administration, this disproportionate number of people who've been arrested were black and brown. And I think people will say that if this is a challenge in New York City, how can you address this issue, for example, nationally, because it is a policing issue, and people feel that police were not the best option to use to address it.
So I'm hearing the magnitude of the question for sure.
Yeah.
And so let me start by saying, when you're making change, by definition, there's a certain amount of sequencing and priority. So the first thing I wanted to do was get rid of the broken and unconstitutional policy of stop and frisk. That, when I came into office, that was the burning issue in terms of police-community relations and fairness. Hundreds of thousands of particularly young men of color being stopped unfairly, unduly, and creating a huge rift between police and community. First focus was to end that. We did. We continue to get safer while we did it. We then retrained the entire police force to de-escalate conflicts. We provided things like body cameras, implicit bias training to change the nature of the police force, neighborhood policing strategy, building relationships between police and community members.
I know you're finishing that point, but you brought up something that goes into the next question. And so when you talk about stop and frisk, there was it was 2013, the federal judge ruled that it was stop and frisk was unconstitutional. Now, still, every statistical point shows that the practice in its varying degrees is still going on, but it's still mostly people of color who've been arrested, who are continuing to be arrested.
Well, let me separate.
Go ahead.
The stop and frisk is used now minimally and only with specific justification. In other words, the previous approach was broad brush, just stop people, no specific description of a suspect for a crime or anything like that, to the point of 700,000 stops in 2011. We're talking now, I think the last numbers I saw, between 10 and 20,000 a year based on specific situations. There was a crime, here's a description of someone stopped who fits the description.
And the vast majority of those people are still people of color who have not committed crimes according to recent data.
Well, but if the stops are based on actual specific data, if a crime is committed in the neighborhood and someone fits the description, that's at least a valid approach to stop. It still all has to be done constitutionally, to say the least. But this is an entirely different approach. And we've seen it in the relationship between police and community, which has healed and mended in some very, very profound ways because we got rid of the negative of all those stops. And the neighborhood policing approach is actually about building those relationships. We didn't have that before in this city. Actually focusing on police officers staying in a community long term, getting to know people literally first name basis, becoming of and by and for the community. So there's always more to do. And I would connect this to mass incarceration too. We are constantly reducing mass incarceration in the city. It's down 30% since I took office. It's going to go down, I think, another 30% in the next few years. But part of that is arresting a lot fewer people. And this is so you talk about the whole country, what could we do? I think this approach to policing, neighborhood policing, community policing, done on a national level, retraining all police officers in de-escalation, moving away from a heavy arrest model, which we don't need, and which has been the basis of mass incarceration. We're proving it here. This is now the safest big city in America. And this is not an easy place. We've proven that you could constantly change the nature of policing. And with a much lighter touch and a much greater dialogue with the community, you actually get safer. This is a model that we need in the entire country.
When you say safer, can you define what safety means for you and who is that safety for?
Safety means, and I always say, statistics are crucial, but we think of them in terms of humanity, right? Safer because the number of murders has gone down to an all-time low, because if you look across a whole host of crime categories, they continue to go down. We're now at a level of overall crime that it was last time we were this low was the 1950s in this city. Now, is it perfectly distributed? No, there's more. There's still some neighborhoods that have persistent crime problems, which we're addressing by now sending more focus, more police, whatever it is, new strategies to address those problems. The difference now, and this is crucial, is in the past, police would be sent into an area sort of like a blitz, no connection to the community, and there was a disconnect between police and community. Now it is developing a notion of neighborhood policing where there's that sense of we're all in a specific place together on a common mission. It's a very, very different reality. I've talked to a lot of community leaders and activists who say that now having a personal relationship with the police officers, and more of the officers coming from the community too, is another crucial part of the equation, Our graduating classes now are, give or take, half people of color in recent years, give or take half neighborhood residents of the 5 boroughs in New York City. It's also about changing the composition of the police force to be more representative. That, combined with a strategy that emphasizes personal relationship development and understanding each other's reality, makes a huge difference.
I'm curious, and we'll touch on another. I'll let you respond to this final question. Still, what do you say to people that, even given what you said, the vast majority of people who are stopped, even if you're arguing that it's a legitimate stop, there's still people of color who, at the end of the day, have not committed a crime?
There's no question that the goal here, if you had the ideal, is you only stop one person, and that is the person who committed the crime, right? But I want to be fair that the most compassionate, sensitive, just policing still must involve trying to stop someone who's committed a crime from committing another crime. And if there's a description and you're following that description very loyally, very specifically, you might stop more than one person trying to find the actual person. That is not necessarily a sign of the wrong kind of policing. The question is it done through a model that teaches officers work with a specific description? That's what we're here to do, to stop specific crimes, not to paint a community with a broad brush, which is what happened for years and years, and really put a rift between.
And you don't feel that that is happening now?
No, I do not. Terrell, I speak to community leaders, I speak to clergy, I speak to elected officials, I go to town hall meetings, and New Yorkers are pretty vocal. They're pretty opinionated people.
True.
You're going to hear it. So what I hear consistently is that the nature of policing is changing. And there's a sense that there's actually a dialogue finally between police and community members. And that more and more policing is being done in a way that specifically is about what happened, not the color of someone's skin or what neighborhood they're from, but what specifically happened, and addressing that problem. And that's why arrests are down. Again, 150,000 fewer arrests than 5 years earlier, and crime getting lower. Much deeper dialogue between police and community. We're finding tremendous possibilities for change. But for years and years and years, we were told that was not acceptable, that would not work, there'd be chaos, there'd be disorder, there'd be crime. We were lied to, constantly. We were lied to. We are only beginning to experience how much safer we can be if we change our approach to policing and we bring police and community together and we de-emphasize arrest. There is a whole new world out there. And part of why I'm running for president of the United States is because I've actually seen how much change can be made and how quickly it can be made in this big, tough place. Just in the course of 6 years, we've got an entirely different reality in the way we police. And it's working. I want to spread that model all over this country.
Now, the NYPD recently fired the police officer who killed Eric Garner in 2014, but you've been criticized for not publicly supporting this officer's firing. How are you working with the police department to ensure that this situation does not linger on for years like it happened with him?
Okay. So the most important part of this to me, and I know the Garner family, they've been through hell, and we have to always remember the human cost here. So I want to talk about why I approached this case the way I did, but I want to say at the same time, the most important thing to me is that there never be another tragedy like the one that befell Eric Garner, that we literally say this is the very last one. And I believe this is not a utopian idea, not only here in New York, but for this whole country. If we systematically change our approach to policing, I think we can get to the point in this country where this never happens again. And that's what we have to believe in. Let's face it, we all came up seeing these kind of tragedies as way too common. And we've got to stop accepting that notion. We've got to say, what do we have to do everywhere to stop these tragedies from happening? And we found here, retraining the entire police force in de-escalation, body camera on every officer, implicit bias training, neighborhood policing, we see something very, very different. And that's what we have to do for the whole country. In this case, what I knew was we had to have a fair and impartial process because the Garner family never had that. They didn't get that from the U.S. Justice Department. They didn't get that from the local DA. There was no trial. We had to make sure this was a fair process, and I kept my emphasis on that. And lo and behold, there was a trial, a public trial with the NYPD. An NYPD judge said he should be terminated, and ultimately the commissioner concurred with that. That's the first time there was a justice process for Eric Garner. The federal government stood in our way for years and years and told us not to proceed because they were going to proceed, and then they didn't. I want to make sure this decision, which I think was based on justice, now holds so we can turn this page for everyone. It will be challenged in court, but I wanted to make sure the way I handled it was beyond reproach and we could move forward as a city, and that's what we're doing now.
So here's another question. You talk about systemic reform.
Yes.
There are several candidates named, particularly Julian Castro, who's called for qualified immunity to be either limited or eliminated in the case of police officers. And that's basically where the officer can be personally sued as opposed to the city, absorbing the costs and lawsuits, et cetera. And so Julian, who I've interviewed several times, Castro, he said that officers would think twice. That's considered to be one of the more radical approaches to challenging police officers who, may choose to violate their badge. And so I want to ask you, what do you think about limiting the doctrine of qualified immunity or getting rid of it?
So I take a different view. And again, one of the things that comes with running something as big as this city, is making sure that people are safe and making sure there's justice at the same time. I think our police officers, and overwhelmingly, our police officers get into the work for the right reasons and do the job the right way. And it's a very tough job, and it's a dangerous job. And it's a job where they were not trained properly for a long, long time. Because all the things I'm talking about that we changed here are indications of the fact that officers were not trained in de-escalation. They were not trained in having a real relationship and dialogue with the community. That was not part of the concept, and that's part of what hurt all of us. If you train officers properly, if you supervise them properly, your chances of having these kind of tragedies go down deeply. And that's where we need to put our energy. I do not want to see a situation where good officers trying to do their job, trying to protect each other, feel that they are going to be susceptible to lawsuits all the time. I think that creates a counter situation that's very dangerous for public safety. So I think it is all about the strategy and philosophy we bring to policing, the training, the supervision, the way we recruit and ensuring police departments are representative. These are the ways we change things, not bringing more lawsuits into the equation.
I'm curious as to, when you talk about more training and more policing, I'm pretty sure you've seen the videos in which white people are have weapons, they have knives, and officers routinely find a way to not kill them. And it's the case with a black person, and this is even proven by statistics and research, that a black person who's not even armed is more likely to be killed than a white person who is armed. And so how does training deal with that issue? Because there are a lot of researchers and experts who feel that training is not enough and that officers just feel too emboldened to do what they want because they know that the law ultimately is going to allow them to get away and that they won't have to face jail time.
Well, a couple of things. I would argue to you very strongly that every profession, and this is a profession, although it wasn't treated like a profession in a whole lot of ways. So here we gave people weapons and gave them the mandate to protect other people and life and death decision making, but we didn't give them training in how to approach a situation of conflict. We didn't teach how to de-escalate. We didn't teach implicit bias training, all the things that could actually help our officers to do their job better. We have seen in this city, when you apply that kind of approach constantly, and where all the supervisors, all the leadership is reiterating a different approach to policing, it has a huge, huge impact. You can see it live right here every single day. And that's why I know we could make big changes for this country. I think we should never underestimate what leadership and education of people does for them, because it hasn't been there before in too many instances. So now you have plenty of examples in this city, and they're captured on the body cameras. Body cameras are a huge part of the equation. They make everyone think, and they also tell us the truth. I have now many, many examples of officers of all different backgrounds showing tremendous restraint. In fact, in 2018 in New York City, the number of times a weapon was used in an adversarial dynamic, a couple of dozen times in all 365 days of 2018 in a city of 8.6 million people.
Right, you had the population drop?
Yeah, we had 365 days a year, 8.6 million people, 36,000 officers there, I got it right.
Yeah, okay.
But we're talking about weapons were very, very rarely used. And lots of situations caught on tape of tremendous restraint. So these things can change, and they can change in a way that actually reflects fairness. And then the fact that, God forbid, there is a situation where there's a tragedy, there has to be a sense of accountability. We just saw accountability. We didn't see it from the U.S. Department of Justice, which I think is unacceptable, and I think should not be allowed in the future. And I've said legislation should be passed that forces the Justice Department to, in a speedy, timely basis, make a decision on a civil rights case like this. But where was there an actual fair and just process? It was the NYPD's own process, which sends a very powerful message to everyone involved that there can be fairness in the end, and there can be accountability.
I think this whole process also shows that even at a local level, that the mayor can't control everything. There's certain limitations that you have as an city executive to address a policing issue. So I think a lot of people would ask you, even though a lot of you were accused of not firing an officer, which you legally can't do.
Correct.
Right. But people would say, well, how can you address this issue nationally, even at the local level where your power is somewhat limited?
Well, you make an important point. And I don't blame anyone, given the intense and honest emotions here and beliefs, that people would say, well, why can't you just fire the guy from day one? Well, first of all, I remind everyone, we all believe in due process. And if the shoe's ever on the other foot, we all want due process. Second, there's state law that stipulated that only the police commissioner could make that decision. Third, again, we had the U.S. Department of Justice telling us, don't do anything because they were going to potentially bring higher charges, and they told us not to act. All of that is hard for everyday people to understand. I get it. But in the end, I'm working from a place of conscience and saying, what's the best thing for this city, and ultimately for this country as well, to have a fair and just process that led to an outcome. There was accountability. And now we got to move on to the much bigger work of making sure it never happens again. That's how I approach it. Now, as president, I would draw on that experience because a lot of other folks who are running, again, very good people, they've never dealt with anything like this. A lot of the people running have never had to deal with the complexity of a situation like this, trying to build change in an often contentious atmosphere, running the most diverse place on earth, which means you have a sensitivity to all the different people who make up the community. This is something very different, and I got to tell you that, and it comes from my own personal experience too. I never doubted that we had to make a profound change, and I learned a lot. You know, when I started out in public life, I was working for Mayor David Dinkins, who was the first African-American mayor of New York City, who tried to make big changes, came up against huge opposition, including from the police unions.
So a race riot. I mean, they literally raided City Hall.
There literally was a riot. That's right.
Right.
And,
it was terrible.
And I was working in City Hall at the time, so I understood what kind of opposition to change would exist. My own experience in my own family, I've talked about my son Dante, and I talked about him very openly, and that led to a whole lot of opposition. Literally saying I have a black son, and I had to prepare him, as millions and millions of families have, for the reality out there, talking to him as a young person about what he might confront. Ideal young man in every sense, and yet having to explain to him that he could be misjudged, he could be in danger. It's very personal for me, so I could not leave things the way they are. And this is a very different city now, and a very different police force. And we've only begun. There's a lot more to do. But it can change. And I think the difference here is you either know it in your heart, you know that change is possible and must happen, or it's theoretical to you. To me, this is not theoretical in the least. This is very, very personal, and that has driven me to keep pushing for more and more and more. What I got to tell you, the good news is, you push a system, you push a structure, you demand change, it can actually happen. Don't expect it to be easy. Don't expect a bunch of people to let go of their status quo lightly. But if you push hard enough, the change can happen.